Right, I'm sorry, I kind of lost track of time there. So, what we were talking about was conceptualizing a research question, right? And we were talking about this example. We talked about the first week of college and conceptualizing that. You could conceptualize this as a very crucial time that has a lot of impact on, how a student feels about their university, whether they decide to go forward with studying in that particular university or not, what sort of peer groups they become a part of, right? What sort of friends do they end up making, right? What sort of classes do they enroll in, right? So you could conceptualize it, using other literature on the topic as being an extremely crucial an extremely crucial time for students, right? What about the experiences of students? When we talk about the experiences of students, and in the last video we sort of ended by saying that if we conceptualize it in a realist sense versus a phenomenological sense, that would have consequences for how we look at experiences of students. Now, I had begun by saying that with a realist approach, the experiences of students would be assumed to be there without the students, whether the students are there or not. What that sort of means is that with a realist approach, you sort of assume that there is such a thing as experiences of students, right? And these can be studied by looking at students themselves, right? Given a more phenomenological approach, however, your assumption is more that these experiences that there are of students, right, they are specific to the students themselves, right? Not to say that within realist research, this is not an assumption that realist research assumes that all students will have the same experiences, but phenomenological research will look at these experiences in a lot more detail, with a lot more sort of trying to take the perspective of the student themselves. So with a phenomenological approach, you will have that, you're trying to walk in this person's shoes. Right? You're really trying to understand all the breadth of their experience, right? That's what you're trying to do with a phenomenological approach, right? With a more realist approach, you are still trying to understand their experience in a lot of detail, but in a much more broader sense, because you're trying to understand, you're trying to use their experience to understand a social phenomena, the social phenomena of what are experiences of students in their first week of college. So you're not so much interested in, you are interested in their experience, but you're interested in it so far as it tells you something about a social phenomena, right? Whereas in phenomenological research, you are interested in their experience itself rather than being interested in it in order to understand something better about a social phenomena, right? So even though earlier I said let's look at it from a phenomenological lens, this sort of question is best suited to a realist kind of approach, right? I hope that makes sense. Let me sort of pin that down as well, that with a realist sort of approach, you will be interested in understanding students' experiences, right? However, you will be interested in knowing their experiences as long as they tell you something about the social phenomena of what students' experiences are like during their first week of college, right? Whereas with a phenomenological approach, right, you will be interested in the experience itself, and you will want to really look at the experiences inside out. You will want to understand the texture of this experience, right? The gradient of this experience. You will really want to live it, walking their shoes, right? So that would be the difference, and you would conceptualize the experience very, very differently if you're using a realist versus a phenomenological approach, right? So this is how your epistemology sort of ties in with your conceptual framework, right? So yes, so let's move on. I hope that is clear that, this is how you conceptualize all the different bits of your research. Let's go back to our discussion of what makes a research proposal what it is. We had talked about, different research questions and how they shed light on different aspects of a particular topic of interest. We talked about conceptual framework and how conceptual framework is something more than a literature review. It conceptualizes all the different parts of your research question, right? Epistemology is contained within the conceptual framework, right? You can perhaps even do pilot studies, and those can also be a part of your conceptual framework, right? So yes, but your conceptual framework basically looks at, just to simplify it, it looks at different parts of the research question, and it talks about how you're going to be approaching these different parts, how you're conceptualizing them, right? What else is part of the research proposal? Next, we come to another very important bit of it, which are called the methods, right? Now, a discussion of your methods includes who you're going to be talking to, your participants, right? It includes a discussion of, what sort of techniques will you be using, what sort of techniques you'll be using to collect data. So it includes data collection, your participants, obviously, who will you be talking to and how many people will you be talking to, right? Then you also need to have in your methods a method of analysis. How will you be analyzing this data, right? Then you also need to address concerns of validity here. And you also need to address questions of ethics, even though, ethics is something that you ought to be discussing in all parts of your research, really. But your method roughly is made up of all of this. And again, when you're discussing all of these different aspects, you constantly need to be asking yourself why. So if you're sort of saying that these are the participants that I'll be talking to, you need to have a reason for this. Why am I talking to these people? Why am I not talking to some other people, right? Similarly, with your conceptual framework, if you're conceptualizing stress a particular way, you need to have an answer for why you are not conceptualizing it any other way. Or if, for example, you're conceptualizing experiences of students a particular way, why aren't you doing it in any other way, right? So methods. So, you will need to have a discussion of participants. You will need to have a discussion of data collection procedures. What sort of data collection procedures are you using? Semi-structured interviews. Are you using focus groups? What could be issues with using, either of these? Now, if you're doing online research, what could be problems with that, right? So all of those need to be discussed in your method section. Your analysis, how will you be analyzing the data that you have? What sort of methods will you be using, right? So that again is something that needs to be included. Why will you be using one method of analysis over another? That is something you also need to discuss. Validity, how will you ensure that your research is valid? One of the things that you do in order to address validity again is constantly answer to the question why. So you constantly say, I'm doing this because of this, I'm conceptualizing this because of this, I am conceptualizing stress this particular way because, of this reason. So you always have to provide a reason, and that just makes your research more valid, right? Ethics, questions of ethics, again, need to be addressed everywhere. Participants, how will you ensure their confidentiality? How will you ensure their rights? How will you make sure that their rights are not being violated? How will you ensure ethics within data collection? If, for example, you're recording the interviews that you're doing online, how will you ensure that this data is kept private? Even during analysis, that you do not sort of publish something or analyze something in a particular light that might harm your participants in any way. So all of that, ethics is actually built in to the whole of the research proposal, right? Your research proposal, when we talk about RQs or research questions, they also need to have some discussion on what the goals of your research are, right? And we've talked about how there are 3 different levels of goals that might be there, right? But in terms of what are you trying to achieve with this research? What is the broader goal here, right? So that is something that also needs to be discussed in your research proposal. We have this diagram here. Let me just... Right, so let's look at this. So, this is basically all of the contextual factors that influence a research design. So you have your research questions right in the middle here, right? Now, these are influenced by a number of factors such as, funding. Again, if a particular agency or an institute is interested in the sort of research questions that you're asking, that obviously will have an impact on what sort of research questions you ask. Then here you have participant concerns. Those can also influence the sort of research questions that you ask. Your ethical standards can also influence the sort of research questions that you ask, right? The goals bit of it here, right? Your personal goals, your participant concerns, the perceived problems that you see. So you might see that people who care for individuals who have terminal illnesses, right? They have some problems, they do report some problems, and that will obviously go into the goals section, but then that will also influence the sort of research questions that you ask, right? So this connection here is also necessary. Now, when we look at conceptual framework, right? So your existing theory and prior research, right, can also be a part of your conceptual framework. Some bit of it is what we will call the literature review, right? Existing theory. So again, we will sort of simplify it, and rather than using whole theoretical frameworks, we can just conceptualize different parts of the research or all the parts of the research, right? And let it sort of remain there. We're not going to be looking at thought experiments and preliminary data and conclusions, but we can look at pilot research, right? So if we conduct some sort of pilot research, that can also inform your conceptual framework, right? Your personal experience can also influence your conceptual framework. So unlike quantitative research, where your personal sort of experience has no role in the research process itself, qualitative research does make room for that, right? One of the interesting things here is that here you look at methods. One of the things that influences methods is researchers' skills and preferred style of research. So that can also be an influence on your method section, right? Your research paradigm can obviously have an impact as well, right? What sort of epistemology you're using obviously has an impact. So for example, if you're using phenomenological research, you will have to do something like semi-structured interviews or something that really lets you get to the core of the experience, right? So yes, so this is a good sort of diagram to look at and ponder over. But yes, I think we're pretty much done with chapter 5.